Good afternoon, everyone. What we will have shown in previous studies that the number of folds, okay, just to give me a second. Number of folds is limited. Right? There are a handful of folds, and in fact, in 1991, there was a paper from Cyrus Chotia who showed the number of folds which will be there, which will, every single protein can fit into it, will be somewhere around 1,000. And the numbers are pretty close to it. So this he predicted in 1991, where the number of structures are very, very less. So what it shows that the sequence, the tertiary structure that they adopt, or the arrangement of secondary structures, which are known in nature, are quite limited. So with this knowledge, the number of folds are limited. If you are elucidate, if the experimental structures are able to elucidate all known folds, then the question then remains is that given a sequence, okay, so if I start with a sequence and I give you a library of fold, then all you need to do is so library of fold essentially means that I have set of representative structures of each of the fold, some L large n number of folds. Then I'm going to fit the sequence in each fold one by one, and then going to find which fits the best. Okay, which fold fits the best to a given sequence. And such approach is what is known as forward folding problem. That means you start with a library of folds, and when this library of folds are a set of tertiary structures which are experimentally determined. And this is what is known as forward folding problem, which is what is typically used in order to predict tertiary structure of proteins. Other is called inverse folding problem, and this is something very interesting. This is more of intellectual interest, even though there are limited use of actually applying inverse protein folding problem. The inverse folding problem states the following. So if I have a structure, suppose I'm just making some structure, and then the question is, can you give me a set of sequence? Set of all sequences, not set of, set of all sequences which can adopt this particular structure, this structure or fold, whatever you can say as. Okay, if you can give me set of all sequences, and these sequences that I'm talking about is not something which is naturally occurring. You can generate sequences of whatever you feel like, and then find all sequences which can fit into this set of fold is what is referred to as inverse protein folding problem. Now you realize, which I just mentioned, the sequence that I'm generating is it's not natural. That means I'm looking at all possible theoretical sequences. And so even though problem looks very interesting, it looks interesting from the following perspective. For example, I want to design a protein sequence which will adopt a certain fold. Then this particular problem is very interesting. But from a practical standpoint of view, to predict tertiary structure of protein, this problem is not very interesting, because the computational cost to actually generate all sequences and finding a fit into a fold is very, very computationally very, very expensive exercise. In fact, there are, because this structure is rigid, the number of the side chain that it can adopt is also going to be very, very difficult. So that's the reason that even though the inverse protein folding problem looks very interesting in order to design protein sequence, so on and so forth, it doesn't remain a very practical solution. So what is typically done in structure prediction is to use the forward folding problem. Okay, that means I have a query sequence, and I match it to a set of folds. Okay, so I have one fold and some other fold and so on and so forth, and find the best fit. between the sequence and the fold that I'm looking at. Okay, whichever fold it fits the best, that is the answer. That is the fold which it belongs to. Some query, let me see. Okay, so the question is, how do we know which fold is the best? Well, I'll come to it, how to determine. This is where the protein structure prediction problems begin. I'm just stating what the problem is. Okay, but there is some scoring function that you can find, which will tell you which is the best fit. Now there were this is 1990s, when there were two competing groups which were trying to propose solutions to predict tertiary structure of protein, or they defined problem from two perspectives, that is taking the forward folding problem. One strain of method was known as fold recognition, and the other strain of method was known as threading. The objective of either fold recognition or threading is to find the best fit of a sequence to given set of folds. Okay, that's the purpose of both of them. But the way that they try to achieve is what is different. In the fold recognition approach, what is being done is that you're trying to use alignment between your sequence and feature space of the fold. Okay, so the feature is somehow encoded into a sequence, then you're trying to align this in a fold recognition. On the contrary, in threading, as the word says threading, what is being done, suppose I have a certain structure, what you are doing in some sense is to actually take your sequence. Suppose I have some sequence, I'll just write something. Okay, you take this sequence and literally thread through every single position on the structure. Okay, so what you're doing, you're putting this A, K, G, M, N, N, P, and then keep moving. I mean, this whole sequence till you find the best score between the sequence and the fold that it is being threaded on. So what you're doing essentially is taking the sequence and literally threading over the structure and trying to find at what this, in this case, the score, what you're looking at is actually the energies, the best energy in which, or the best energy that you can obtain, which will take this particular sequence on this fold. Okay, and what are the best energy that you can find for each fold, you compare them and then finally derive which fold is the best for that particular sequence. And we'll look at one strain of approach in order to derive energy, so which is what is known as the statistical potentials. I'll tell you which part you can listen to it, but you do not worry about for this part in the examination. What I'm discussing is something which I can probably ask in examination, but once I touch upon statistical potential and forward the way the method works, I'm not going to ask in the examination. That you can know how these things are done, such that you can appreciate the difficulty and the advancement that has happened in protein tertiary structure prediction. Okay, so let me. So the approach, which is and both threading and fold recognition, as I said, is the forward protein folding problem, and both are trying to align the sequence to a fold. In threading, this is something which is done on trying to fit a sequence and compute the energy scores, whereas in the fold recognition, there is some kind of alignment that is derived, which is and comparing the sequence to a feature of fold. So one of the first method which was developed by Eisenberg in 1991, And threading was the term, I mean, the fold recognition also given by Eisenberg, and threading was given by Janet Thornton, who was a leading structure prediction person. Okay, so who was leading tertiary structure prediction person in those days. So in the approach of David Eisenberg, what was done that you take a structure. Okay, I'll show this in a while. So what you do is you take a structure, and then so structure is a 3D information, right? Whereas your sequence that you're looking at is 1D information. The question is, how can you align a 3D to a 1D information? And as I said, you want to now discretize this 1D, 3D information into one dimension. And the way that they do that they did was to actually convert these three-dimensional, the local features of sequences, local feature of residues, and basically encoded them per position. Okay, for instance, suppose I am looking at a particular tertiary structure. So suppose I have a 3D information. I'm just giving you one example of it. So I can say my the first position is, let's say, is helix. My second position is helix. Third position is a coil, and third, fourth position is a turn. So this is one kind of information that you can think of, secondary structure, right? So similarly, they used whether residue is buried, whether residue has covered by polar atoms, and using all this combination, they derived 18 environmental profiles. Okay, so what they're doing is each position that is in the structure is encoded in any one of these 18 features. Okay, profiles or features, whatever you want to call them. And so once this is encoded into a feature, you can now align, you can basically find all homologous sequences that are known for that particular structure, and then generate for each position a profile that is the residue, the amino acid propensity for each position for that particular feature. Okay, so this is what they call as 3D to 1D profiles. Once you have such a profile, then all you need to do, so this becomes profile, and the alignment which you're trying to seek is a sequence. Then you can perform sequence to profile alignment. Then becomes a very standard exercise, which was also developed in this group by Gribskov in 1987, how to align a sequence to a profile. So let me show to. So I'll show what I mean by feature of a fold. So switch. Okay, so this is what the fold recognition method is. So you want to generate alignment between a protein sequence. Okay, so objective function scores the sequence structure compatibility by using the sequence, and they have used the following properties. Let me go to the, I think this is in the next yeah. So they have encompassed into various environmental types. Okay, so for example, you can define area buried and give something, give a name, let's say E. E is a residue which has fraction polar between 1 and 0.8 and has area buried between 0 and 40. You call a residue to be have an environmental feature of P2 if the area buried is between 40 to 120 and has fraction polar residue surrounding in every single that particular residue between 1 and 0.6. Okay, so that's how they derive. So each one of them are kind of encoding the feature. So because the feature is continuous, so they discretize the feature, and the feature are given a name. So this is what they call as environmental class. So for example, you have the first residue. These are the residue numbers. So you have the first residue. So this is of the environmental class which belongs to B1. That means this is the B1 type that you're looking at. That's a feature of the residue position. This is position information, and the secondary structure that it has is alpha. So similarly for the second one, and so on and so forth. And for each residue, then for each position, not residue, for each position. Now this is my position. This is my first position. For this position, I have amino acid propensities. So what I have now is, these are my amino acid propensities at these positions. Now the amino acid propensities are derived by aligning homologous sequences. So once you have this profile, right? So this is the profile which they generate. So now these are my positions. These are my position, and all I need to now align is my PA system. This is what is also called the position specific scoring matrix. This is for 3D structure, but if you use a sequence, this becomes a sequence feature, sequence derived PA system. So such a profile that you're looking at, environmental class profile, now can be aligned to a sequence, as I said, using the sequence profile alignment. So this is the procedure which was developed by David Eisenberg in 1991. And so there are many methods which were subsequently developed in order to align two sequences using various kinds of features. I mean, need not be structure directly, but this is one of the approaches where the structure features are encoded into a one-day information, and that one-day information now gets aligned to a protein sequence. The other approach that you have, which is threading. So as I said, threading assumes and relies on the fact that you have to have a limited number of folds. Okay, and then I said you literally thread the each sequence on the fold and then try to find the fit. Okay, so what is the objective that you're trying to do? I mean, we'll see this what the quasi energies are in a moment. So what is being done is that you take each sequence, and this is just a representation of this. So suppose I have the template as shown here. So this is one template, and this is second template, this is my third template, this is my fourth template. I take this sequence, thread through each of these sequences, okay, and then find which is the best that I can fit. Now the question is, what is the objective function which will find the best fit between a sequence and the threading that you are running over it? Even though this is, I mean, it's more in explanation term that you use the word threading, but at the end of the day, they also use some kind of alignment. So what is being done is that what you can imagine that for each of these structures, and this is of course at the end of the day, it's a sequence encoded over here. You take this sequence and you take this sequence, you generate an alignment, okay, and then once you generate alignment, you actually kind of replace every single residue that is where they are aligned by the residue property which is coming from here. For example, if I have an alanine and at the position I end up in getting D, then I replace it by aspartate and see whether the aspartate can actually sit there. Okay, and how do you know aspartate can sit there? Is by computing the energy of that particular sequence mounted on that particular fold. That's what is typically used when you're trying to do a threading. Now, so this is another representation what you have. So suppose this is my protein sequence. I have a structure that you see here. So what is being done is that you literally place each of them in these positions, and wherever you have a gap, you simply don't have to put any residue in those positions, and then try to evaluate whether this will be a proper fit in this particular structure or not. Now this is just to give you a sense what can actually happen. Okay, So if you look at this, I mean, you have this is, you know, threading of a particular sequence on some particular fold, and then if you see, look at the residue which is being replaced, right? So I have valine being replaced by alanine, and my A is being replaced by leucine, F is being replaced by L, and K is being replaced by L. Can someone tell me whether this fold will be an acceptable fold? By looking at this organization, can someone tell me whether this will be a stable fold? So I have, this is in my original fold, and let's say if I generate a sequence, then I fit this particular sequence in this. Will this be a stable fold or not? And why?
So I think it's not stable.
Why?
Because lysine is positively charged.
Correct. So what you, so visually what you can see is that this is kind of a hydrophobic packet which is being formed. However, this is being kind of really perturbed by this charged residue which is sitting over there, and charged residue doesn't like in a hydrophobic environment, and therefore this particular structure would be, and this particular fold will be not be acceptable for that particular sequence, and therefore, you know, this particular fold or this particular alignment will not be an accepted solution. So the question is then, I mean, this we are doing for one example. However, how do you do for every single possible situation? So this fit that you're trying to generate between a sequence mounted on a structure is computed by pseudo energy function, which is a pair interaction. I'll explain in a bit what pair interactions are. Okay, and these are empirical energy functions. That means they are not trying to find the, you know, I mean, in some sense they are not exactly local minima is not the structure that you'll end up in getting, but you can use them as a relative energy functions in order to find which one is, you know, has a lower energy than the other one. So the potential which are used in any of these are known as statistical potential. The reason these are known as statistical potential because they use the statistics of occurrence. So the word pair means you're trying to derive the possible interaction of favorable as well as unfavorable interaction encoded between a pair of residues, and this is called pair interactions. And these are statistical potential because you're trying to use the statistics of the occurrence of those residue pair in the PDB database to derive these potentials. So they are either called statistical potentials or knowledge-based potential because you are going to use PDB structures in order to derive these potentials. So these energy functions or the statistical potential function is essentially trying to find whether that particular sequence would fit into that particular fold or not. So before I did tell you a little bit detail about the statistical potential, I wanted to set in some of the assumptions that are done in order to generate statistical potential. Now, from here onwards, what I'm going to discuss is not a part of your course examination. I will not ask this, okay? This is, I'm telling you purely for your interest in order to appreciate how these energy, I mean, when you say something is fit into a better fold, what is the basis of deriving this? So there are three fundamental assumptions that are done in order to derive this statistical potential. This was started by Jerrington in 1970s, then followed by Manfred Sippel, who actually derived and kind of gave more formal definitions of statistical potentials. So the three assumption is that you can actually capture the minimum energy state of the system can be captured by these potentials. Okay, that's one of the assumptions that has been done. The total potential energy of the system can be approximated by the pair interaction. That means I can take, if I have three atoms which are interacting, then rather than trying to find what is the interaction potential for all three at a time, you can take two at a time, each one at a time, and then derive you take those potential, whatever energy that you end up in getting, whatever energy you get, you take this energy and sum them up, and that will give you the total potential energy of the system. And this is kind of giving the total potential energy of the system, and this is kind of assumed to be correct. even though we know that when you are looking at a multi-body interactions, the multi-body energy term can affect your derivation of energies. And the most important observation is that the state which is observed with high frequency states, high frequency, are going to be low energy states. And this is the forms the fundamental basis in order to derive the statistical potentials. Let me shift to whiteboard and then write what these potentials are. Okay. Statistical potential or knowledge-based potentials use a formulation of Boltzmann in order to derive the energy of the pair interaction between any two given state. Now, if you want to, if you take the Boltzmann distribution, it says that. So, if I say that there are two residues, let's say two amino acids, let's say A and B, which are and let's say you are trying to ask the question that they are sitting at some distance away. So let's say I have two residues, two amino acids A and B, and they're sitting at S distance apart. Okay, and sequence wise, in terms of sequence, A and B are separated by K residues, right? So these are three parameters that you define. So then you can write so then if you want to find the frequency of occurrence of these states, this will be given by the Boltzmann equation, where 1 by z is your partition function, that is the summation of all energies that is associated with the microstate of this particular system. Okay, and this is your E raised to power minus energy of this system A, B, S, and K divided by KBT. Okay, now this is, so if you know your energies, then you can find what is the occurrence, the frequency which such amino acids separated at some distance apart and some K residue apart will occur. Okay, so this is the state that is being defined. Now, since you do not know what the energy that is associated with that particular state, you only have the frequency of occurrence, and this is what you know because this comes from your PDB database. Okay, so that means you can, if you know this, then you can try to derive the energy of the system. Now, without you can take the natural log at both the ends. I mean, and I'll leave it. I'll write a simple form and not really derive the whole thing. You can, and this will be your minus ln minus E A B. Okay, so you can move this particular part on this and move E over here. So E K A B S by KBT will be simply be given by minus natural log of your F K S. The problem is that you don't know what Z is because you do not know how many different states that are known for this combination, and that becomes kind of a limiting factor. You can move KBT over here, which will kind of make it more general set. Okay, so this is when you're trying to ask two residues sitting at k distance away and having the separation in distance by some angstrom. So this is I mean so what you can do is you can ignore any residue type. You can keep the distance k and the s and can generalize. So that means if you take summation of all residue combination that is over there and then write with this, and what is this state is what is now known as a reference state. Okay, and you can then subtract these two numbers and generate your delta energy between the two states as and these terms that you have, you can kind of keep them some constant, and you can kind of literally ignore for all calculations. So your total energy function that you're trying to derive, so what you're trying to use, you are trying to use the information that is embedded. Since you can compute these frequencies from the PDB, these frequencies come from PDB, right? So you use the count of frequencies, number of times that you see, let's say alanine and aniline separated by 4 residue apart and has distance of 1 angstrom. How many such occurrences do you see? You count this and you take the summation over all amino acids, and you define this to be your reference state and compute the energy. That means what's the contribution of these two amino acids in order to stabilize the interactions. And this particular form of potential is what is known as distance-based statistical potential, because you're relying on the distance in order to derive potential. You're actually using distance as a criteria. So you can do 1 angstrom, 2 angstrom distant potential. And this is what is, I'll show some example how this potential nicely gets converted into energies. So this is the formulation and this is the count. So what you see on the left is, so this is interaction, what you see in the PDB distribution of isoleucine and aspartate. Okay, so this is what you see. Okay, so this is, you see the distribution of distances between aspartate and isoleucine. And so if you see this distance and you convert this into this using the formulation which I just described, you see this become converted to nicely flat potential. You have absolutely no attractive interaction. In fact, this gets repulsive at such a close distance. They do not like to be close to each other. And if you use your known information that isoleucine is hydrophobic, aspartate is a charged amino acid, and therefore they do not like to be close to each other. If you now do the same distance distribution for isoleucine and leucine, okay, now if you look at it, you at some end the energy becomes negative and kind of becomes favorable of these two residue to be close to each other. So that's what is done in the complex formulation which is just given over here. You convert these distances, what you see, into energy functions which can try to tell you which residue need to be close to each other and which residue would repel each other. So even though they are, so the statistical potential, the main difference of all this statistical potential is in the way that you take reference state. In fact, all the potential that are known to be derived and used in studies is actually dependent upon what is the reference state that you are considering. Depending upon the reference state that you are considering, you will change your potential and the success of that particular potential. So this is the distance-based potential which you derive. You can also do something which is not dependent on distance. That means I'm not going to look at what is the distance between two amino acids. Rather, I can simply look at whether two residues are in contact or not in contact. Now, this is what is given by contact-based potentials, which is simply defined as your using the same formulation. So what you're doing is, what is the energy that is because of the contact of two residue when the two residue are in contact versus what is the reference state. So reference state is what is the reference state is typically defined using quasi-chemical approximation, which is the occurrence of the two residue that you see. So for instance, if I have just imagine if I have all alanine in my sequence, then the fact that you have two alanine in contact is not a big deal because every single residue is alanine. On the contrary, if this is not the case, then if you have two alanine interacting, so the two alanine interacting and the occurrence of alanine rare, then you can say the fact that two alanine are interacting must be because of the reason. So that's the overall basis in using contact potentials. And so you use, so what is done in these threading is that you compute something called total energy, which is a combination of your pair potentials plus some kind of a distance potentials. There's some kind of a solvation potential. So this formulation that I just described is a very general formulation. You can have anything mentioned in place of R, or need not use the S as any cutoff. So you can use for dihedral angle, you can use for solvation. But the point is that you can use the information of residue interaction that is present in the PDB with respect to some reference state and convert them into energy functions, okay, which can be used in order to score the potential. So if you see, I think, so in case of, so this is a method GenThreader, so which is one of the initial method derived by Janet Thornton group. So if you see this, they're using a pair potential. They have solvation potential. So they use two potentials in order to derive this. So now you can imagine what is being done is that you generate multiple sequence alignments. You take the sequence, mount onto the structure, compute the potential, and see what the potential is. And then you're going to judge whether the potential is good or not based on the distribution of the overall potential. Then that's what the basis of doing threading. So so this is another method called FIRE. I mean, we'll probably use in the today's class. So with this, I will move on to the methods in which you some of these variations of these template selection method. So one thing which I missed in defining it, let me define it. I should have done it right in the beginning. So if you look at different class of structure prediction methods, so you have two class of structure prediction method, or all the methods can be classified as two different types called template based modeling, or simply called as TBM, and template free modeling, okay, or simply called as TF. And these were defined in 2007, and I'll tell you when they were defined. So look at the word template. So template essentially means the fold which I was mentioning. So template refers to a protein sequence for which you know the experimental tertiary structure. You actually know the structure, okay, which is solved using experiment. So this is known. So this is what is known as template. So as the word says, template based modeling, that means I have a sequence, I find the template, and then I generate the structure or predict the structure. Okay. Now, as the word says, template free. So in the template free, and this is also what is known as ab initio structure prediction method. And there is a lot of debate on whether the alpha fold is truly defined as a template free modeling method or not. So in ab initio method, the overall idea is to use first principles in order to create tertiary structure of protein. You do not want to use any information that is coming from the knowledge of protein tertiary structures. So that's the idea of using the template free. Now, what is the advantage of using template based modeling, or what is the advantage of using template free modeling? So suppose you have a sequence for which there is no fold known. Okay, there is no fold known in the database. Now, since you're doing matching a sequence to a template, you may find some weak template identified, you fold onto it, but the prediction that you're doing can completely be wrong because you mounted on an incorrect template. So, however, template-free category methods have an ability, because they're not using any known knowledge of the fold. So, when there's no fold known, template-free category will become highly successful. But the problem with template-free modeling is the success rate of template-free modeling is extremely poor. It's less than 20%. That means if you're looking in the real world and you're trying to predict a structure of a protein, you do not want to bet anything on template-free modeling. It's a computation is very expensive, and it's the success that you can predict tertiary structure of protein also becomes extremely low. Whereas a template-based modeling, you have a very high success rate. If you can find a template, you probably be able to generate a very reliable tertiary structure. Whereas but if you end up in getting a wrong template, then God help you, because then you cannot get the right structure. Now, so there was a lot of thought in 1990s. I said this is kind of a holy grail for structure biologists, is to able to predict the tertiary structure of a protein, right? So there was a group which was formed in early 1994 by John Moult, and so they started a competition called Critical Assessment of Structure Prediction, or simply called as CASP. So CASP did something very interesting. So what they did, from 1994 onwards, what they used to do is to conduct every 2 years CASP competitions. Now, what is this competitions? So in this competition, the CASP organizers will release a sequence, a set of sequence actually. So they will give sequence, and then there are a set of folders or predictors whose job is to predict tertiary structure of protein. Will take this sequence and predict the structure of it. But then how do you know whether these structures are correct or not? So what CASP organizers are doing, they are picking up set of sequences for which the structures are going to be released very soon. That means some experimentalists have solved the structure and the structure is going to be out very soon. And so that means whatever the structure for whatever structure they are predicting, there is a structure which is going to be published very soon. That means the CASP organizers can actually assess, they can evaluate whether the prediction is right or not. Okay, so they can evaluate whether certain predicted structure is correct because they know the experimental structure and this is the predicted structure. They can compare the predicted structure with the experimental structure and find which method is doing the best. And this in past 2 decades, because of this constant competitions with a lot of pressure on trying to improve the prediction methods, it has come to a stage that method like AlphaFold has been developed, which are kind of really taking this prediction into a different area altogether. Okay, so and this is a very, very tightly fought competitions. Very big grants depend upon whether your CASP predictions, you are one of the top CASP predictors or not. So there's a lot of weight onto this CASP prediction, which I mean the output is can be seen in 2 decades where the success rate was extremely poor. We're able to now predict structure for many of the sequences that are known that are now known. So that's what CASP is doing. So let's look at, so once you have a template, now how do you get the structure of the protein? So let's So I have some slides dedicated to it, and let's see whether you get some sense of how these structures are predicted. So there were multiple methods which came in, which used multiple templates in order to derive or find the best template. Because let's say I have 10 different template, threading and fold recognition method. Only one of the method give me right answer, but the rest other methods give me some right answers, some wrong answers. So I can combine these, and these are what are known as meta servers, which became very popular in 2005, 7, and around 10 onwards. So this is one of the methods called Lamets. If you're interested, you can use this in order to predict template for any given sequence. Now, how do you do template-based modeling? So one of the very early method which was there, which probably some of you would have heard, called as modeler. Okay. Now, the overall purpose, the overall flow of the modeler, if you see, so the flow starts with you identify the template. Once you identify the template, then you perform alignment with the template and then try to build a model. Okay, so basically, so in modeler, in very crude sense, what you are doing is to actually replace each amino acid with the amino acid or sequence what is being aligned. So whatever in the alignment, it replaces it, and then try to optimize for whatever the distance. Suppose I have, in place of 2 alanine, if I have 2 leucine, which are bigger amino acid, I need to adjust my backbone in order to move them away. So the overall process which happens in a modeler is trying to what they refer to as, they're trying to optimally satisfy the spatial restraints. What are the spatial restraints? Spatial restraints, suppose I have 2 residues which are let's say 6 angstrom away. Then what I want to do is the aligned residues at these positions also need to be 6 angstrom or somewhere on 6 angstrom. So this is what they're trying to do in their approach. So there's a lot of background work into in order to come to this. What they do is actually look at all the structures, in not really template structure, but look at all the structure and generate what they call as probability density functions. That means I can find what is the probability that I have 2 amino acids sitting at such certain distance away, and I can generate general probability of finding any 2 given amino acid or a particular 2 amino acid that's at certain distance. And these potentials then can be used in order to judge whether my structure that I'm trying to find or trying to mount, whether they are coming to be correct or not. So the restraints that are derived is primarily from the templates. The restraint that which residue need to be at what distance apart gets to restraints are derived from your template, gives you all the restraints. So if you use more than one template, you'll have multiple restraint that will come from it. And then you simply use a general knowledge of the general probability density function, for example, for as I said, for 2 amino acids sitting a certain distance away, and use the restraint. That means that you need to place 2 amino acids at certain distances, and then find the structure which will satisfy this particular condition, and then you generate the model out of it. There's very nice anecdote associated with the modeler. The whole modeler program, the whole coding was done single-handedly by the person who developed this, Andrei Shally, and in a month of in 6 months in 1994, there are 2 papers back to back on how modeler works, and each paper is not less than around 10 to 12 pages in JMP. So this is very, very remarkable development in 1994 when people were able to model structures based on template. So one of the problem with modeler is that it pretty much sticks to whatever has been as given as an input, that is the restraint in the template. It doesn't allow a lot of variations into it. So one of the complaints with modeler is that if you generate structure using modeler, the structure would not deviate much from the modeler, and this was a problem which people were trying to address in subsequent method developments. So this is a method which was developed subsequently, which became very well known in 2004 and 2005 CAS competition called CASR. So in this, what is the USP of this particular method was that and there's another method called Rosetta. So Rosetta and Tezzer both rely on this, fragment-based approach. So the overall idea is that if I want to assemble structures, I can break into small fragments, and then I can subsequently assemble this fragment with some knowledge that which fragment interact and how do they interact. Okay, that means I can put all these fragments together like a jigsaw puzzle by the knowledge purely of the energy functions. So the key in both Rosetta and Tezzer is the energy function that you're trying to derive. And if you are into folding and you're trying to derive, you want to compute energies, your energy should be such that if you're, suppose I am trying to look at some energy distribution, then I need to start. So suppose this is my starting structure. Then whatever I do, the next structure that I pick up should bring the structure closer to the lower energy base, something what is called the native structure. So this is what both Tezzer and Rosetta try to do. They work a lot on the energy function and improve this energy function to become better and better. There's a lot of debate in the area of what kind of energy function. I mean, is it really something like what I have shown, in a nice, nice direction going towards value, or something like a golf course model? That means the energy function look like this. That means I have a structure over here. In one shot I can go down, but there is no gradual decrease in energy which will bring it down. So this is something like a protein folding pathway, but this is not what if you have energy function which behave like this, it's extremely difficult to fold a protein using this. So the difference between Tezzer and Rosetta being is that in Rosetta these fragments are dealt in real space, whereas in Tezzer they are discretized, or they are kind of projected onto a lattice. So what is being done is that you take these structures and project on a lattice, which I just discussed in the morning. That is a set of imaginary lines, and where they cross they call lattice points. You project on the lattice, and advantage is that they do extremely fast computation. That means if I want to sample conformations, they're going to be very fast in terms of computation, whereas the sampling of conformations in real space is going to be very slow. Just imagine you have to rotate by 1 degree, 1 degree, 1 degree. It's going to take a lot of time. Whereas I say, no, you can either take 1 degree or 10 degree. There's no other something in between. So that means you're going to do discretized move are going to be better. So that's what is done in Tezzer. You project onto a lattice, and this is what they have derived, set of multiple energy terms which kind of derive or move the structure to a native bin. So so this is just a representation how the structure looks like projected onto a lattice. You kind of, if you see this, you have this green color which is a real structure, and what you have, the red structure, is the projected onto the lattice. So it looks very weird because the structure is no more like what you see in a typical. Distances will be violated, but they allow a very fast computation. So you do a Monte Carlo simulation on these lattices and find a structure which will satisfy in terms of energy the lowest energy structure. So this is very briefly about Tezzer. I'll just touch upon Rosetta and be done with it, what the protein structure prediction is. So Rosetta does both template-based and template-free modeling, but they are very well known to do a template-free modeling. So in the template-free modeling, the fundamental problem is you're developing an accurate potential. That means whatever you start a structure with, your structure should try to go downhill. So if I start from this structure, the sampling should be such that I can pull the structure towards lower energy structure. This is what ideal potential should look like. And the most important is how do you search? Okay, that means sampling strategy need to be extremely good. Otherwise, you can be really stuck. So just to give you some understanding, so suppose I have a backbone and then I have a side chain like this, and so I can keep doing motion in 1 degree motion, and then keep finding energy state which are very, very similar to each other. They're kind of really futile search space, right? Because you are trying to twist and then find energy, and then trying to twist another, find energy, and that can take forever to find the answer to it. So whatever protocol or whatever the procedure that you develop need to be very efficient, and that's where so Rosetta has kind of addressed the first problem quite accurately. Even though there's a lot of debate in the area, whether the potential what they have derived, they call their potential is as golf course like potential. So that means you have very small range of low energy basins. If you touch it, you end up in getting to low energy structure. Otherwise, you can keep roaming around it. So they say that in terms of Rosetta, you need to sample. Do enough sampling, and the result you will be able to find it. So that's the approach of Rosetta. So very briefly, they operate in two different ways. There's something called as a coarse-grained folding and another refined approach. So what they start with is completely unfolded conformation. For each of the unfolded state, they basically generate fragments. Or basically for every single residue, they have a set of 5 angle that they can take. And what they do is they basically move the backbone in a 5 space. They move by some particular degree, and then say whether this particular move will be accepted or not using the Metropolis condition. That means if the energy is low, you accept it. If the energy is high, then you use Metropolis condition to decide whether you're going to accept or reject the particular move. Okay, so this is just to show figure for it. So you have fragments, you generate fragments derived from each of these fragments. Then you try to assemble these fragments. And in the fine-grained refinement, what you do is now as I said, they move in 2 phases. One is the backbone. That means you remove all the side chain, move the backbone, which will give you a broader range of motions. And then you project the side chain onto it. That means get the side chain back onto their place, and then see what is the fitting that they do. Then you optimize the side chain. And they keep going back and forth. So they do 5 cycles of backbone, then they do 2 cycles of side chain motion, and then keep doing this exercise, keep computing energies, keep sampling the energy space, and towards the end, what they call that you can start from if you're sample enough, then you can find the native structure. This is what they starting structure is. This is all kind of structure that they generate in between. This is the sampling all the in different conformation states, and this tells you how far they are away from the native structure. And the end, you end up in getting, if you're lucky enough, you may find native structure over here or find native structure over. So that's what is done in the Rosetta. So both Rosetta and Tezzer, they have different strengths and different weaknesses. So Rosetta being a very sample intensive approach, it relies on very extensive sampling. That means if you're going to run Rosetta, you better be ready with HPC kind of system to actually execute it. So there are many interesting things so Rosetta was developed by David Baker, extremely brilliant person who does structure prediction. So he has done, in 2009 and 2010, he had run a competition for school students where what they were trying to judge is whether human intuition can assemble a structure. So what they did was to students who are completely, do not know anything about protein tertiary structures or have a bare introduction to them, they gave them a structure as to assemble, purely visual interpretation, and ask them to solve the structure. They say, we will assemble them the way you like with certain rules in place. And interestingly enough, what he had found is that the human intuition works pretty well. That means they were able to, these students who were, high school students who are more into gaming, they were able to assemble the structure and give pretty close to structure which is close to native. Native essentially means the structure which is determined experimentally. He also started something called as a fold at home. So because Rosetta requires extremely large computing power, what they developed is very nice. You can download this script, and what this script does it basically find the structure for which you're trying to predict the structure. In their, of course, Baker group or anywhere what they are running on, and that particular structure will be downloaded into a system, and then the sampling would be done into a system wherever the script runs. And once the sampling is done, this is kind of loaded back to the server. So this way, the computing power, when you are not doing anything, the system is sitting idle, these can be used. And he has developed many very simple techniques in order to harness the computing, idle computing power of the world. And it's a very successful approach. With the development of AlphaFold, so AlphaFold came in 2018, and very nice prediction in 2020 CAS competitions. So what AlphaFold works on, I mean, in general, is to actually improve the information about the contacts. So as said, I mean, if you know the contacts, the methods are all there. That means you can assemble the structure. So there, most of the approach is trying to get the contacts as correct as possible. So the whole machine learning, various convolution deep learning method they have used using CNN or different layers is only to improve the multiple sequence alignment, derive meaningful contact information. So that's the AlphaFold. I mean, if you want to know more detail, I can talk about it tomorrow, provided there are sufficient number of students who are interested in knowing what the AlphaFold is. So this is about, very briefly, about how protein structure prediction works. Even though there are many details which are completely overlooked in the interest of time and whether you would really need it. But what is the take-home message from this? The take-home message from this is that there are very extremely powerful prediction servers which are out there. Now you can give the sequence to them and predict reliable structures. Now once you have a reliable structure, then you can do whatever experiment you want to, or you want to study, do docking studies and something like this. But you have to keep an eye the structure which you have predicted, trying to find multiple evidences to say that structure is very close to it. Otherwise, you can actually become completely wrong. So this is what I wanted to cover, and if you have any question, I can address, and then I can move on to the point which I wanted to show for with the exercises that I have handed over. Any question that you have?